So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this panel discussion on what modern slavery is. My name is Pia Cantini, and I work for Save the Children Italy as Child Protection Head of Department. And this afternoon, I will be the moderator of this first panel of the conference that is organized in two parts. We will have first about 45 minutes panel discussion, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience for the panelists. So before starting, just a brief introduction from my side. So we will talk today about slavery. That is one of those words that seems belonging to the past. But if you really think that slavery is something of the past, well, during these 2 days, you will have definitely to think again. As already said, millions of people around the world are trapped into modern slavery. And they could be working for you, for us. Children of the DRC mining minerals to produce our mobile phones, and women and girls working in garment factories for less than €4 per day in Bangladesh. Pickers picking leaves, fruit, and vegetables to be sold in our market for a low price. These are just few examples. And often these people are facing threats and violence, and they are caught into debt. Many have fallen these oppressive traps simply because they were trying to escape poverty and support their families and to get a better life. So can we do something to stop that? Can we be more aware and prepared to recognize the signs of modern slavery? So we are going to answer some of these questions during this panel. And we will do that with the three experts that are this afternoon here with me. So we will have Giovanni Abbate here at my right, Labor Exploitation Prevention Manager within the Coordination Office for the Mediterranean of the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. We will have Katharine Bryant, Head of Policy and Programs at Walk Free and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. And then we will have online from Geneva, Mr. Tomoya Obokata, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, including its causes and consequences since March 2020. So I would like to start posing a question to Mr. Obokata. I'm not sure whether he's already connected. Here you are. Okay, welcome. Mr. Obokata, so you are a professor of international law and human rights at Keele University and specialized in transnational organized crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery. So I would like to ask you your perspective on what modern slavery is and definition of modern slavery.
Thank you. Let me just pull up my slides, and I hope you can see that. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very topical and important conference. And before going into my talk, will focus on the various definitions of gross human rights violations that are pertinent to myself. But before going into that, I thought I could explain what I do as a United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. Now, this post was created originally by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2007 and has been extended ever since. I focus on issues such as traditional slavery, debt bondage, serfdom, child and forced labor, sexual slavery, and forced and early marriages. In terms of my key functions, I conduct fact-finding, firstly through thematic reports that I submit to the Human Rights Council, as well as the United Nations General Assembly each year, and also through country visits. In relation to recent visits, I went to Sri Lanka in November last year, and this year I will be going to Mauritania in May, and hopefully another country later in the year. I also transmit communications and urgent appeals to state and non-state actors, including businesses, when I receive allegations of contemporary forms of slavery. Now, these are quite important because they encourage these actors to investigate these allegations and take appropriate actions if necessary. And finally, I also engage with all stakeholders, including the civil society and academia, as well as faith-based groups in different parts of the world through an event like this and regular consultation that I hold on in every year. So these are some of the key functions of my post as a UN Special Rapporteur. And now I'd like to move to discuss various definitions, starting with the difference between traditional and contemporary forms of slavery. In traditional or chattel slavery, the defining element is the legal nature of slavery and the slave trade, where slaves were regarded as legal property for owners. Examples include the infamous transatlantic slave trade, but the similar practices existed in various parts of the world. In contrast, in contemporary forms of slavery, there is no legal right or ownership over persons because these are strictly prohibited under national and international law. Other attributes of contemporary forms of slavery include, first of all, globalization, which, among others, has resulted in advanced transportation, making the movement and exploitation of people much easier and faster. Modern technologies such as the internet, dark web, and smartphones are nowadays being used to buy, traffic, and sell people. And finally, because of the illegal nature of contemporary forms of slavery, we can see the involvement of criminals, particularly very sophisticated, organized criminal groups in different parts of the world. So, what exactly is slavery? The definition was given in a very important international treaty known as the Slavery Convention 1926. Under this, it is defined as the slavery is defined as the status or condition of a person over whom any or all powers attached to the right of ownership are exercised. The key aspect here is powers attached to the right of ownership and not the ownership itself, because as I said, that has been prohibited in national and international law. So the examples of the powers include control or coercion over a person's autonomy, restriction on the freedom of movement, lack of consent, threat or use of physical or psychological violence, and abuse of power and authority. Next, we have servitude. This is stipulated, among others, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights, 1950. Now, these instruments do not provide a precise definition of servitude, but it has been described in the past as a particularly serious denial of liberty by the European Court of Human Rights, where people are coerced to provide services and live on another's property against their will. The examples of servitude include debt bondage, serfdom, servile or child marriage, in accordance with the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the slave trade, and institutions and practices similar to Slavery, 1956. In addition, forced labor is an important issue which I deal with on a regular basis. According to the ILO Convention on Forced Labor 1930, forced labor means all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty or for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Threat of any penalty includes coercion, violence, isolation, and restriction of movement. The involuntary nature refers to a lack of consent. The main difference between forced labor and servitude is that there is a feeling that the conditions are permanent in a case of servitude, highlighting the long-lasting nature of control and power over persons in comparison with the forced labor. And finally, we have trafficking in persons. Now, I'd like to say here that I do not necessarily deal with trafficking in persons because there is a separate special rapporteur on this subject, but as you can imagine, trafficking and exploitation are closely interlinked. The definition of trafficking is provided under the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons 2000, which is attached to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, this instrument provides a rather long definition, but for the purpose of my talk, I will simply highlight three key elements. The first element is an action element or actus reus of the offense of trafficking in criminal law terms, and that is to recruit, transfer, harbor, or receive a person. And these are done with the use of the second means element, including coercion, deception, abuse of power, position of vulnerability, giving and receiving payments. And finally, trafficking is carried out for the purpose of exploitation, either sexual or labor exploitation. A note of caution here, though, is that this third element is a mental rather than action element. So this is a mens rea in criminal law terms of the offense of trafficking. So this offense is complete as soon as someone is recruited, transferred, harbored, or received. If these victims are exploited afterwards in practice, and that is technically separate offenses of either forced labor, servitude, or slavery. So people tend to get confused as to whether that exploitation is also part of the definition. It is in a sense, but that is a mental rather than the action element. So to conclude, slavery, servitude, forced labor, and trafficking share some common characteristics, such as coercion or control over persons and lack of consent. Whether an act can be regarded as one of these depends on the nature and extent of such control or coercion in a given circumstance. But in general, slavery is regarded as the most severe form of coercion or control, moving down to servitude, and then forced labor. Thank you very much for listening. Then I'll stop here and I look forward to having conversations later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Obokata, for your explanation. So, Katharine, as said, you are co-author of the Global Slavery Index and have worked in counter-trafficking and anti-slavery programming for the past decade. So, could you tell us more about the phenomena and how big it is, and give us some data?
Gladly. Thank you so much, Pierre. And thank you, everybody, for having me along today to talk about our work at Walk Free. Franca gave an introduction to the Global Freedom Network, which is the faith-based arm of Walk Free. But just very briefly, Walk Free is an international human rights group headquartered in Western Australia, and our mission is to accelerate the end of all forms of modern slavery. We're well known for the Global Slavery Index and other world-leading research, which we use to develop the evidence base for our advocacy and engagement with government, business, investors, and faith. Now, I will just very quickly talk about the definition that we use at Walk Free. So we use modern slavery as an umbrella term that encompasses many different forms of exploitation that were just defined and are defined in international law. So human trafficking comes from the 2000 Protocol. We include forced marriage, which comes from the 1956 Slavery-like Practices Convention, as well as forced labor, which comes from the Forced Labor Convention. Now, common to all of these types of exploitation are that they are all forms of exploitation where there is some kind of element of coercion, threats, deception. So there's an inability to leave this situation, which is why we use the umbrella term modern slavery in all of our reports and all of the work that we do. So the starting point for our work is the global estimates of modern slavery. And this is produced by Walk Free with the ILO, with the International Labour Organization, in partnership with the International Organization for Migration. And this was released in 2017 and was the very first globally agreed estimate of modern slavery. And we estimated that in 2016, there were some 40.3 million people in modern slavery around the world. When you break that down by gender, we see that modern slavery is a very gendered issue. Approximately 71% of that 40.3 million figure are female. If you put that another way, that is 1 in 130 women and girls around the world today are in some form of modern slavery, which is shocking when you think about it in those terms. The global estimates of modern slavery measure just two forms of exploitation, that is forced marriage and forced labor. And we estimate that the breakdown is 15.4 million people in forced marriage and 24.9 or nearly 25 million people in forced labor. Now, I want to just kind of pause for a second there and just remember that although these are shocking statistics, behind those numbers are actually individuals experiencing these forms of exploitation. So you see women and girls being forced to marry, men who've migrated perhaps overseas and then forced to work for free in repayment of some debt they've incurred along the way, otherwise known as debt bondage. Or it may be children forced to work in the absolute worst forms of child labour who are then unable to attend school. So the global estimates of modern slavery that we produce with the ILO and the IOM provide that global estimate as well as the regional breakdown, which you can see on the screen behind me. Now, it's important to note that every single country, every single region in the world experiences some form of exploitation. And you'll see that it's most prevalent in the Asia-Pacific region, followed by Africa, Europe and Central Asia, the Americas, and the Arab states. I will say when this data was first produced, we had limited data for certain regions around the world, and we've been working over the last few years to try and plug those gaps. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Then, as well as affecting all countries, one of the key messages that we put out in our report in 2018 was that it actually affects wealthier countries more than we previously thought. This is both in terms of exploitation of migrants, which you can see through the Europe and Central Asia figure as an example, but also in the import of goods and services into those countries. We estimate that of the top 10 most at-risk goods being produced by, top 10 goods most at risk of being produced by forced labor, that equals about $354 million per year being imported into G20 countries alone. So it's important that the exploitation occurs within individual countries, but also affects the global supply chains and all of the items and goods that we purchase every day. Now, the Global Slavery Index itself, moving on from the global estimates, breaks down that the global and the regional figures into national level estimates. And it aims to answer three key questions, which are how vulnerable are people in a particular country, how big is the problem, and what are governments doing to respond? And we provide the answer to those three questions for 167 countries around the world. So in terms of the 10 most vulnerable countries we see, you'll see again on the screen, this includes countries such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Sudan, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, and the DRC. Now, we assess vulnerability. We have created a vulnerability model of what makes people most vulnerable to modern slavery, and it encompasses 5 dimensions. This includes governance, lack of basic needs, levels of inequality, disenfranchised people, as well as the effects of conflict. So many countries you'll see on the screen are actually those that are predominantly affected by conflict. Moving on to that second question, how many people are in modern slavery in every country around the world? We see that the highest prevalence countries, and that's prevalence in terms of as a proportion of the population, includes countries such as Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Cambodia, North Korea, Mauritania, Central African Republic, Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Burundi. And we see in some of these countries the actual involvement of the state in the exploitation of individuals, North Korea being one example of that, where the state is actively involved in exploiting its own population. And then on to the final question, looking at the 10 strongest government responses. Apologies, responses has just dropped off the bottom of the screen there. So these are countries that have a strong response and are taking a lot of action to respond to modern slavery. This includes countries across Europe as well as in North America. Now, we assess government responses across 5 dimensions again. This includes government action around victim support services, criminal justice mechanisms, coordination mechanisms, addressing underlying risk factors, and also engaging with business. And we see that, particularly across Europe, some really encouraging developments around the engagement with business, around mandatory human rights due diligence, for example. Now, that tells us part of the story, but also what's important is that when we take GDP into consideration, you get a very different list of countries. So if you're talking about countries that perhaps have fewer resources, but actually have quite a strong response, we see countries such as Georgia, Moldova, Senegal, and Sierra Leone. On the alternative side, we see countries that have more wealth, more resources at their disposal in order to respond to this issue, and you see that those countries taking less action would include Qatar, Singapore, Kuwait, and Benin. Now, 2022 is a huge year for Walk Free, both in terms of obviously today's conference, which we're very pleased to be at, but also we'll be releasing the next edition of the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery in the next few months, again in partnership with the ILO and with IOM. And then later in this year, we'll be breaking down that global figure into national estimates and answering those 3 questions of how big it is, what makes people vulnerable, and what governments are doing to respond for 167 countries around the world. And that will be coming out towards the end of this year. So please keep in touch so we can share those findings with you. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Pia.
Thank you, Katharine. So, Giovanni, you have been involved for 6 years in the management of projects developed with the public and private sectors here in Italy, and you have also direct experience in assisting vulnerable groups arriving by sea. How do these definitional concerns play out in IOM work?
Thanks, Pia. Thanks for your introduction, your words. Good afternoon, everybody. Both those connected remotely and both you in this not-so-sunny room today. I say modern slavery is, here we are, a sociological umbrella terms that encompasses a lot of different legal concepts, from debt bondage to forced marriage, forced labor, slavery, human trafficking, labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, and so on. Modern slavery actually is about somebody who is controlling another person and is making profit on his exploitation, exploiting his vulnerability. And this is everywhere, it's among us. So I said before, it's about people picking our fruit and tomatoes, people cleaning our houses, serving our food in the restaurants, cleaning our rooms in hospitality services. Also situations which are apparently regular, normal job can hide a situation of slavery, can hide a situation of violence, threat, coercion, deception. Slavery, forced labor, human trafficking are not interchangeable legal terms, and terminology do matters, definition matters, of course, in the way of legal certainty. Legal concepts are important because are about the capacity of the state to criminally enforce the law in terms of prosecution, on punishment. Terminology, legal definition, international consensus among on definition is important because foster data collection, comparability of data all over the globe, and research. And we know how important is research because on good research, good initiatives are built. Good activities in the field are developed, and the impact on the lives of persons is better. On this, for example, IOM is glad to have participated to this work, but also to be part of the counter-trafficking data collaborative, which is the first world data hub on human trafficking. And but for IOM perspective, legal definition matters specifically in terms of the victim's perception, meaning that for someone being framed as a victim of labor exploitation, forced labor, slavery, human trafficking, means being eligible to a specific form of protection. And to a specific form of protection. But yes, reality has shown to be more nuanced than legal definition, no? Because situation can evolve, can change in terms of time, in terms of space. A situation that starts as human trafficking situation can evolve in a forced labor situation. And this consideration make the work of legal practitioners, labor inspector, law enforcement very complicated and challenging. If we go to next slide, we see as some overlaps make the practical application of such a terminology quite complicated. So for example, human trafficking is a wider concept that slavery, that forced labor, it can end or not in a slavery situation. And for example, IOM experience at border management when applying protection mechanisms at the border described that the real challenge is the early identification of victims of trafficking, meaning that it's important also in terms of prevention to identify the victims of trafficking before of the actual exploitation occurring. In that case, somebody can be designed, it can be identified, detected as a victim of trafficking also without the element of exploitation, just because of the purpose of exploitation of its trafficking. Trafficking can give also rise to forced labor, of course, as an outcome, but forced labor can be a situation totally not linked to a situation of trafficking. If we see, for example, thousands of migrants arriving to Europe by sea, they arrived willingly in Europe through Lampedusa, and then ended up exploited in exploitative conditions in our agricultural field, in our restaurants, in our hotels, accepting willingly maybe a situation which fall under the definition of labor exploitation, but not for being a victim of trafficking. Forced labor, of course, becomes slavery when the victim has no chance to determine himself, for example, because of the restriction of freedom of movement. But in all the cases of labor exploitation, of course, can be framed as forced labor and of trafficking. And well, all these legal definitions matters, but still reality and operations have to be informed by legal definition, but can happen a bit before the current implementation of the definitions. All these considerations are very well known to IOM, which has been working on the prevention and fight to modern slavery and human trafficking since 1990s, before that the Palermo Protocol was adopted. Since then, almost 100,000 victims of trafficking and modern slavery have been detected, identified, assisted, and supported. And always the organization has applied the 4Ps approach, which has been envisaged also in the Palermo Protocol. So prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. On the side of prevention, the work of IOM is aimed at, of course, on one side, raise awareness of migrant communities at risk of slavery and human trafficking with different tools, global campaigns, social app, work on the social media. And very innovative program of IOM is on the side of prevention is IOM Mix, which is an innovative global campaign And I really suggest you to have a look on the website because it's not a normal campaign. It's more like a support for people to develop their own campaign with a lot of materials, tools, instruments, and so on. But we have a sample of prevention in many other regions and many other countries in the world. Then protection. IOM, of course, has been working on the side of prevention, meaning providing legal assistance to victims, referring there to protection mechanisms, sheltering, health assistance, working for their integration into the host community, but also working on reintegration in the country of origins when they decide to come back to the country of origin. And working on protection means also working on the prosecution, because from our observation, the most a victim feel protected, supported, assisted by the system, more efficient will be the cooperation with the justice system, and so the prosecution of the crime. In terms of prosecution, a lot of work is also done in terms of capacity building, training of law enforcement, prosecutor offices, justice officials, in the analysis of the system, of the phenomenon, in terms of data, dynamics, trends, and so on. And partnership. Partnership is a transversal element of our activities. IOM partners with state actors, UN agencies, international organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations, migrants community, diaspora, and the private sector. An example of working partnership is the GLOW Act project, which is a project of the European Union in partnership with the UNODC, UNICEF, and IOM. On different target countries, and IOM in this partnership has been mandated with support of the development in this country of protection mechanisms for victims of trafficking. And I say partnership with the private sector, which has been already is identified as a crucial and important actor in the prevention of migrant workers, exploitation and slavery along supply chains. Well, also in our IOM view, the role of private sector businesses, multinational corporation is very much important. We have been developing two global initiatives. One is IRIS, the other is CREST, that are actually addressing private actors. The IRIS program is a capacity building program for labor recruiters. Actually, IOM try to support labor recruiters which want to identify themselves as a good actor in terms of ethical recruitment along a procedure for the certification of labor standards and ethical recruitment procedures, while CREST is a program which is addressing multinational corporations in terms of capacity building, helping them to detect the risks linked to human trafficking and slavery along their supply chain, in transnational operation, of course. The program developed from Southeast Asia, but is expanding all over the globe. And in this context, in December 2020, IOM also launched the Global Policy Network on Ethical Recruitment, which is actually a platform of state authorities to share best practices and efficient procedure on ethical recruitment. And let me end this this presentation with a brief, very brief description of what we are doing in Italy since we are in Rome. And also can be a bridge with next session. So IOM in Italy has been working over the last 2 years in partnership with the National Labor Inspectorate, providing cultural mediators specialized in counter-trafficking and identification of victims of labor exploitation to labor inspectors during the controls, applying a multi-agency approach which has been very impactful in terms of qualitative and quantitative results. And that might be easily replicated in other countries. So I leave the floor to you, Pia. Thanks for your attention.